Okay, guys, so this is the third and final part of the history of the short story. So, what we're going to focus on now, we're still just very briefly, quickly running through the more modern and complicated history of the short story. One thing that should be clarified, though, is that as these shifts occur and new movements are born and develop, the reason these happen is because these happen because the writers of that time period are rejecting sort of what is the norm from the current movement. So a lot of what you're going to see is this sort of cultural or this conventional back and forth between what becomes in vogue with short literature. This is also, I mean, all of this is true of literature in general, but we're just focusing on the short story, obviously. So you'll see a lot of, as we sort of move through this period from the 1850s to the present, you see that whenever a new sort of class or cohort of writers comes into power, they reject what has been done before them. So there's a lot of it's almost bipolar in a lot of ways. So it's this sort of back and forth. So we've discussed early Romanticism, the early European Romanticism, and then Romanticism as a whole, which was born out of the United States, and then Realism, which was born out of the United States. Next, beginning in the very early 1900s, was what we call was the birth of modernism, and the focus shifts from plot and story, which was at the forefront in realism, back to characterization, psychology, and mood. So we almost see this shift back to some of the conventions of the Romantic period. So there's this. It was arguably one of the gold, or no, kind of like the pre-golden age of literature. So we see this shift back towards a more impressionistic atmosphere that challenges the conventions that were dominant at that time period. And also, what was very fascinating that sort of came out of this time period, which really hadn't been done before, was that the climax of literary stories focused more on character realization rather than the resolution of a story. So rather than seeing, Darth Vader vanquished, Luke Skywalker has this profound, deep, life-altering spiritual realization. This is what became, this is what modernism was defined by, was this profound, life-changing realization rather than a resolution to the plot. So there's this shift of focus from plot and story more towards what we call the emotional through line. The emotional journey is what's important, and the emotional journey is sort of guided by the plot, but the plot itself really isn't that important. We will read a lot of modernist writers, not necessarily these, but we will spend a lot of time reading and discussing Romanticism, modernism, and then postmodernism. So Conrad, James Joyce, Kafka, Virginia Woolf, William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, Fitzgerald. Hemingway and Fitzgerald were sort of the rock stars of that time period of modernism. Everything changed during and immediately after World War II, though. The world had become a much, much darker, more bleak place. And during World War II, right after World War II, modernism died. The art of that time period, whether it was music, literature, visual art, lunged itself into this period of rebellion where it was all about rejecting everything that had come before, that old world, in the wake of all of this horror from World War II, the world we knew is dead. We can never go back, so we have to start from scratch and push our way forward. So there's this vast period of diversification at that time. We call this period right after World War II up until the mid 1980s to the early 90s. This period's called postmodernism. There's still a lot of discussion and debate what we're in right now since then. Some people call it metamodernism. Some scholars call it postmodernism. We're still trying to figure it out. Postmodernism is generally defined. It's defined in a lot of very odd ways, but it's generally defined with the rejection of reality within fiction. In a lot of postmodernism, you will have narrators who stop the story and speak directly to the reader. There's a lot of self-awareness that what you're reading is a story. It's not trying to convey this idea that what you're reading is real. So you see some of that. You see a focus on absurdism and satire, and a lot of transgressive qualities. A lot of the literary fiction during the postmodern period is very, very violent and bleak and paints an almost dystopian view of the world. So you see this, we see this shift from modernism of trying to really focus on the psychology, the character, to this this focus of the character, the narrator, as an artificial element within a larger message. Okay. So postmodernism, characterized by stylistic subject and conventional experimentation. That's a very vague way of thinking about it, but we can get a little more in depth from there, in that theoretically postmodernism is about artificiality in the world. You see a lot of postmodern stories that deal with consumerism, materialism, capitalism, war, death, violence, the artist's place within the world, in sort of this time period where artists, musicians, filmmakers, writers are less influential in developing culture, as opposed to the government, violence, terrorists, that sort of thing. Inventors of ironic parodies, self-reflexive metafiction, collages in other languages, and graphic narrative experiments that offer a sometimes difficult but often dazzling postmodern spectrum of contemporary short fiction. So in postmodernism, you see a lot of irony, you see a lot of self-awareness, self-reflection, you see a lot of metafiction, which is, you'll see a lot of stories about writers writing about the stories that are then the stories that we read as the readers. So you see a lot of this manipulation of reality. You also see a great example, this just comes off the top of my head. There's this postmodern writer, Bret Easton Ellis, who his first book became a rather popular and commercially successful movie. And then about 20 years later, he wrote the sequel to this novel, and this sequel references what happens in the movie adaptation from his novel. So he himself, as the writer, is a character in the sequel to the book that he wrote. You see a lot of experimentation like that, a lot of experimentation that plays with reality. You also see a lot of focus on marginalization, often ethnic, racially, socioeconomic, or culturally. We also see a shift in the analysis and theory, the approaches we take to literature. So because of postmodernism, and that the traditional rules no longer apply since World War II, you see we are now, a lot of the analysis focuses more on the aesthetic, the artistic qualities, and the thematic elements. Because of the major sort of shake-up after World War II, literary theory has become much more refined. There's not a lot of freedom for interpretation. And, no, scratch that. It's not that there isn't room for interpretation. It's that wildly divergent theories from the accepted sort of canon of theory. There's not really a place for that playful experimentation because of how vastly different contemporary fiction is now. So you see now a very few refined conventional sort of conventional guidelines, as opposed to a million different minor guidelines. You see very few major ones, and then beyond those handful of major sort of conventions, you can run wild. Okay. And we also see this idea of the growth and the growth of the experimental narrative that has forced us to sort of characterize traditional literary fiction, and then this out there that's way experimental. There's in the 1990s there was this sort of fad of writers who would experiment to the point of putting diagrams, character sketches, outlines, bubble graphs in their fiction. So that doesn't necessarily fit in the category of what is generally acceptable as a narrative, but we have to do something with these new experiments. So you see this great divide between what is traditionally a short story, traditionally a fictional narrative, and then what's experimental. So our focus, I'm going to wrap this up really quickly. So we're focusing on, this class is about the contemporary short story. So we are focusing mostly on everything, mostly on the fiction after 1850. We're going to look a little bit at some Romanticism, some Poe and Melville, a little bit of realism, but mostly we are going to be focusing on modernism and postmodernism. We're going to be focusing mostly on 19th or 20th century literature, and then some so like the 1900s up until like the 1970s is really where we're going to be focusing a lot, within a few things that are much more modern, and then a few authors that aren't easily placed into a certain movement. So we're not going to be reading, anything from medieval Britain. It's mostly 20th and 21st century literature. And I'm a little bit biased. My specialty, my area of focus is modernism and postmodernism. So much of this class is going to be focused between like the 1910s and the 1970s, just because that's what I like and where my education and experience in scholarly research is. I will make 100 arguments through this class that that's the most important period of literature. We'll see if you agree with me. So just to give you a heads up of where we're going, obviously we're beginning this class with some Poe, which is a great place to start, as he is the sort of the father of the short story, in that he quantified it, researched it, wrote about it, and then wrote some of the best ones himself. So that's it for the history. I know this was long. Thanks for bearing with me. I think this is important, though, to lay the groundwork from where we go from here.